My name is Frank Collins, and this happened to me back in 1956, when I was working as a park ranger in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. I've kept this story to myself for years because, honestly, who would believe me? But now, as I get older, I feel like I need to share what really happened in those dark woods. It all started on a chilly October morning. I was doing my usual rounds in my beat-up green Jeep, checking the trails and making sure no campers had left their fires burning. Everything seemed normal until I got a radio call from Jenny at the main office. Her voice was shaky. "Frank, we've got another missing kid. Third one this month." My stomach dropped. In my 15 years as a ranger, we'd had missing hikers before, but never children, and never this many. The first two kids, Tommy Wilson, age 8, and Sarah Peters, age 10, had vanished without a trace. No footprints, no torn clothing, nothing. And now another one. "Who is it this time?" I asked, already turning my Jeep around. "Little Bobby Martinez, just 6 years old. His mom says he was playing in their backyard, right at the edge of the forest." She went inside to answer the phone, and when she came back, 5 minutes later, Jenny's voice trailed off. I pressed harder on the gas pedal. The pine trees flew past my window, their shadows dancing across the hood of my Jeep. Something felt different about these woods lately. The birds weren't singing as much, and even the deer seemed scarce. The locals had started whispering about strange noises at night, sounds that didn't belong to any animal they knew. What I didn't tell Jenny was that I'd been having nightmares. In them, I heard the beating of massive wings and saw something moving through the trees, something big. But that's all they were, right? Just dreams? I was about to find out how wrong I was. The first sign that something was really wrong came 3 days after Bobby went missing. I was checking the old Miller farm, which sits right at the edge of the deepest part of the Pine Barrens. Old Joe Miller called me at dawn, his voice trembling. What I found in his barn still gives me nightmares. 2 of his cows lay dead on the wooden floor, but it wasn't like any animal attack I'd ever seen. The bodies were twisted in strange ways, with deep cuts that looked too clean to be from a bear or mountain lion. But the weirdest part was the marks around the barn, huge scrapes in the dirt that looked like something had landed there. They reminded me of bird tracks, but these were bigger than any bird I'd ever seen. Each mark was as wide as my hand with my fingers spread out. "Never seen nothing like it," Joe said, standing next to me. He'd been farming here for 40 years. "Found something else too, Frank, over here." Joe led me to the back of the barn. There, stuck in a wooden beam, was a single feather. But it wasn't like any feather I'd seen before. It was black as coal and longer than my forearm. When I touched it, it felt warm, like it had just been plucked. I put the feather in a paper bag to take back to the station. As I was walking back to my Jeep, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed afraid to blow through the trees. That evening, I sat in my office, looking at maps of where the children had disappeared. I marked where each kid was last seen and where I'd found the dead cows. When I connected the dots, my blood ran cold. They made a perfect circle around the old abandoned church deep in the woods. Just then, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Martinez, Bobby's mom. "Ranger Collins," she whispered. "I keep hearing something outside Bobby's window at night. It sounds like wings, really big wings." I told her to lock her doors and stay inside, but as I hung up the phone, I heard something that made my heart stop, a sound from outside my office window. It was like leather stretching, like massive wings opening in the dark. When I looked outside, the motion sensor light was on, but nothing was there. Nothing except 3 deep marks in the dirt, just like the ones at Miller's farm. Whatever was taking our children wasn't just passing through, it was watching us. I knew I had to check out that old church, but something told me to wait until morning. That was my first smart decision, and probably my last. The next day was foggy, the kind of fog that turns the Pine Barrens into a maze of gray shadows. I parked my Jeep about a mile from the church and walked the rest of the way. The only sounds were my boots crunching on dead leaves and the occasional drip of water from the pine needles above. I was about halfway there when I smelled it, like rotten eggs mixed with something burnt. The smell got stronger as I walked, and then I heard what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the ground. I pulled out my flashlight even though it was daytime. The fog was that thick. The beam cut through the mist, and that's when I saw it. It was hunched over something about 50 yards ahead. At first I thought it was a bear, but bears don't have wings. And bears don't have horse-like heads with teeth that looked more like a shark's. The creature was huge, taller than a horse when it was bent over. Its skin looked like old leather, black and wrinkled. But the wings were the worst part. They were folded now, but I could tell they could stretch wider than a car is long. I stood there, frozen. My training told me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Then it turned its head, just its head, completely around like an owl, to look at me. Its eyes were red, not just red like when you're tired, but glowing red like hot coals. I dropped my flashlight. The sound of it hitting the ground made the thing stand up straight. Now it was even taller, maybe 8 or 9 feet. What it had been hunched over was a deer, or what was left of one. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound I'll never forget, like a scream and a roar mixed together. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Behind me, I heard the sound of those massive wings opening, followed by strong gusts of wind. But I didn't look back. I just ran until I reached my Jeep. When I finally got the nerve to look up at the sky, there was nothing there, just the fog and the silent trees. Back at the station, my hands were shaking so bad, I could barely write my report. How could I even write it? What would I say? Saw a monster in the woods? They'd think I was crazy. But I knew what I saw. And somehow, deep in my gut, I knew this thing was connected to the missing children. I also knew something else. I had to go back to that church. But this time, I wouldn't go alone. It took me 2 days to put together a search party. Most people didn't want to help after hearing about the dead animals at Miller's farm. But finally, 5 men agreed. Deputy Jim Taylor, old Joe Miller himself, 2 local hunters named Pete and Mike, and Tom Martinez, little Bobby's father. We met at sunrise, each carrying flashlights, radios, and rifles. I didn't tell them exactly what I'd seen in the woods. I just said I had a strong feeling about checking the old church. "Found something else yesterday," Joe Miller said as we started walking. He pulled out a small shoe from his pocket, a child's sneaker. The sight of it made Tom Martinez turn pale. It was Bobby's. The shoe had been found just a quarter mile from the church. As we walked deeper into the woods, the pine trees seemed to grow closer together. The morning sun barely made it through the branches. Our footsteps seemed too loud in the quiet forest. "Anyone else notice there's no birds?" Pete whispered. He was right. The woods were dead silent. Then we found the first clue, scratch marks on the trees, deep ones that went all the way up the trunks. They were fresh. "What kind of animal can reach that high?" Mike asked, his voice shaking. I knew what kind, but I kept quiet. We were about 100 yards from the church when Deputy Taylor's radio crackled to life. Through the static, we could barely make out Jenny's voice from the station. "Frank, something, radar, moving fast. Your direction." That's when we heard it, the sound of heavy wings beating the air somewhere above the trees. Everyone looked up, but the branches were too thick to see anything. "Into the church," I shouted. "Now!" We ran for it. The old church was right there, its broken windows staring at us like empty eyes. The wooden door was halfway off its hinges. Just as we got inside, a shadow passed over the ground outside. Something big, moving between us and the sun. Tom Martinez gripped his rifle tighter. What was that? Before I could answer, we heard something land on the church roof. Dust and old wood bits fell from the ceiling. The whole building creaked. We all pointed our flashlights up, watching the ceiling, listening to the heavy footsteps above us. "Frank," Deputy Taylor whispered, "what aren't you telling us?" That's when we heard the children crying, coming from somewhere beneath the church. The crying seemed to come from behind the old altar. We found a trapdoor hidden under a moldy carpet. It led to a cellar beneath the church. "Bobby?" Tom Martinez called out. "Tommy? Sarah?" More crying answered him. "I'll go first," I said, pointing my flashlight down the wooden stairs. They looked ancient and ready to break. That's when we heard the creature moving again, not on the roof anymore, but outside the church. Through the broken windows, we saw a shadow pass by, then another. There was more than one of them. "We need to hurry," I whispered. Deputy Taylor and I went down first, while the others kept watch upstairs. The cellar smelled like wet earth and something worse, that same rotten egg smell from before. Our flashlights showed us empty wine racks and old boxes, and there in the corner we found them, all three children, huddled together behind some crates. They were alive but terrified. "Daddy," Bobby cried out when he saw us. That cry was loud, too loud. The ceiling above us exploded. Wood and dust rained down as something massive crashed through the church floor into the cellar. In the chaos of flashlight beams, I saw leathery wings, claws, and those glowing red eyes. "Get the kids out," I shouted to Taylor. Gunshots exploded above us. Pete and Mike were shooting at more creatures crashing through the church windows. I heard old Joe Miller scream, then a horrible ripping sound. Taylor grabbed Tommy and Sarah, while Tom Martinez reached for Bobby. But one of the creatures was faster. It swooped down, its claws extended toward the children. I did the only thing I could. I jumped between them. I felt the claws tear into my side, hot pain spreading through my body. But it gave Martinez enough time to grab Bobby and run. "The door!" I heard Taylor yell. "Everyone out!" Through my pain, I saw the other creature going for the children again. I still had my rifle. With the last of my strength, I fired directly into its face. The sound it made was deafening, like 1,000 crows screaming at once. "Frank!" Taylor called from the stairs. "Come on!" But I knew I couldn't make it. The pain was too much, and I could feel my blood soaking through my uniform. "Get them out!" I shouted back. "I'll hold them off." The last thing I saw was Taylor pushing the children up the stairs. The creatures were screeching, angry about their injured companion. I kept shooting until my rifle clicked empty. Then the darkness came for me. I shouldn't be alive to tell this story, but somehow I am. They found me 2 days later, half dead in that cellar. The doctors say it's a miracle I survived, though the scars on my side will never fade. Deputy Taylor got all three children to safety that day. Pete and Mike made it out too, but old Joe Miller wasn't so lucky. They never found enough of him to bury. Tom Martinez carried his son Bobby all the way back to town, not stopping once. The official report says it was a bear attack. That's what they had to write. Who'd believe the truth? But the locals know better. They've added extra locks to their doors and don't let their children play outside after dark anymore. The children don't talk much about what happened in that cellar. Bobby just says the dark birds kept them there, feeding them bread and water. Tommy and Sarah nod when he talks about it, but they don't add anything more. Sometimes on cold nights, I sit on my porch and look out at the Pine Barrens. The creatures are still out there, I know, because every few months, livestock goes missing and those same wing marks appear in the dirt. But they don't take children anymore, not since that day at the church. Deputy Taylor visits me sometimes. We don't talk about what we saw, but before he leaves, he always looks toward the woods and says the same thing. Some mysteries are better left in the dark, Frank. But I had to write this down, to tell someone the truth. Because the Pine Barrens keeps its secrets well, and I won't be around forever to warn people about what lives in those woods. So if you're ever driving through New Jersey and see signs for the Pine Barrens, do yourself a favor, keep driving. And if you hear something that sounds like massive wings flapping in the dark, run. Run as fast as you can, because now you know what I know. Not all legends are made up. Some of them have teeth and wings and eyes that glow like hot coals in the night, and they're still hungry. October mornings in the Great North Woods of Maine always brought fog, but something about this one felt different. The mist seemed to pulse and writhe as it crept between the trees, carrying a bone-deep chill that hadn't been present in years past. Standing at my ranger station window, coffee growing cold in my hands, I watched it coil around the base of the radio tower like a living thing. Ranger Cooper. The dispatch radio crackled to life, startling me enough that hot coffee sloshed over my fingers. Search Team Delta missed their last 2 check-ins. That makes 3 teams this month. The dispatcher's voice wavered slightly. We need you to check their last known coordinates. My coffee mug hit the desk with a dull thud. Search Team Delta was our most experienced group. They knew these woods better than anyone. Their disappearance made no sense, just like all the others. The autumn of 1998 had started normally enough in our corner of Maine. The Great North Woods were preparing for winter, leaves turning brilliant shades of red and gold. But something had changed in the past few weeks. The forest felt different, wrong. It started with the hikers, a young couple who'd wandered off the Appalachian Trail. When they didn't check in at the next waypoint, we sent out Search Team Alpha. They never returned. Team Bravo went looking for both groups. They vanished too. Now Delta. The morning fog clung thick and heavy as I drove my ranger truck up the old logging road. The coordinates placed the last radio contact about 12 miles into the Kenduskeag Valley, near the old paper mill. My headlights caught the swirling mist, creating strange, shifting shadows that seemed to dance just at the edge of vision. The first warning sign came when my radio started picking up interference, a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache. I switched it off, but the silence that followed felt even worse. The fog was getting thicker, which wasn't unusual for these parts, but something about its movement caught my eye. It didn't flow like normal fog. It seemed to pulse. I parked at the end of the road and grabbed my pack. Standard search and rescue gear, plus extra supplies given the pattern of disappearances. The fog had reduced visibility to about 20 feet, but I knew these woods. I'd been ranging here for 15 years. The first mile was uneventful. Just the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional call of a crow. Then I found the first sign of Delta Team, a backpack propped against a tree. Standard procedure if they needed to mark their path, but when I approached it, my blood ran cold. The backpack was covered in what looked like frost, but it was nearly 50 degrees out. When I touched it, the material felt hard, almost like glass. Breaking off a small piece, I held it up to examine it. The fabric had been crystallized somehow, transformed into something that shimmered faintly in what little light filtered through the fog. That's when I noticed the silence, complete and absolute. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. Just the sound of my own breathing, which was getting faster by the second. Movement caught my eye. Something in the fog. A shape, vaguely human but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could switch it on, it was gone. Following Delta's trail led me deeper into the valley. The fog grew thicker, and I started finding more crystallized items, a compass, a water bottle, a radio. Each one perfectly preserved, transformed into glass-like sculptures of themselves. The implications made my stomach churn. Then I found Officer Martinez. He was standing perfectly still, one arm raised as if to shield his face. His entire body had been transformed into the same crystalline material. His features were preserved in perfect detail, frozen in an expression of terror. Through his translucent form, I could see empty space where his internal organs should have been. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. That's when I saw them, shapes moving in the fog. dozens of them, tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to be made of the mist itself. They flowed around trees like water, leaving trails of crystalline frost in their wake. My training kicked in. I turned and ran, not caring about direction, just needing to put distance between myself and those things. The fog swirled and thickened around me, and the air grew colder with each breath. My radio crackled to life, emitting that same high-pitched whine, but now it almost sounded like voices, thousands of them, all whispering just below the threshold of understanding. I broke through the tree line into a familiar clearing, the old paper mill. Its rusted hulk loomed through the fog like the skeleton of some ancient beast. The main building was still mostly intact, including the massive industrial furnace they'd used to burn waste paper. The whispering grew louder. Looking back, I saw them emerging from the trees, dozens, maybe hundreds of misty figures, their forms rippling and flowing like liquid smoke. Where they touched the ground, crystal formations spread like growing ice. An idea struck me. These things, whatever they were, seemed to be made of some kind of vapor or gas, and the mill's furnace was designed to burn at temperatures hot enough to melt steel. I sprinted for the building's main entrance, hearing that awful whispering growing closer. Inside, everything was coated in decades of dust, except for a trail of crystalline footprints that led deeper into the building. Other searchers had made it here too. The control room for the furnace was on the second floor. As I climbed the stairs, I could hear something moving below, a sound like rushing wind, but somehow wrong, somehow hungry. The crystalline trail led to the control room door, which was ajar. Inside, I found 3 more glass-like statues, the rest of Delta Team, frozen in their final moments. The furnace controls were old but simple. The emergency generator still had fuel. They always kept it stocked in case of forest fires. With shaking hands, I started the power-up sequence. Warning lights flashed as ancient machinery groaned to life. The whispering was all around me now. Through the control room window, I could see them filling the main floor below, writhing shapes of mist that seemed to reach upward with elongated limbs. The temperature was dropping rapidly, frost spreading across every surface. The furnace would take 5 minutes to reach full temperature. I had to keep them occupied, keep them from spreading back toward town. Taking a deep breath, I pressed the button for the facility's ancient PA system. The speakers crackled to life. "Hey," my voice echoed through the building. "You want something solid to crystallize? Come and get me." I ran, down emergency stairs, through maintenance corridors, leading them on a desperate chase through the facility. Everywhere I went, they followed, their misty forms flowing through every crack and crevice. The air grew so cold it hurt to breathe. 4 minutes. I could feel them getting closer, the whispering growing louder, becoming almost words. My legs burned as I ran, ice crackling under my boots with each step. Frost was forming on my clothes, on my skin. 3 minutes. I burst into the main furnace room. The massive chamber stretched up 3 stories, catwalks crisscrossing the space above. The huge furnace door gaped open like a mouth, waiting. 2 minutes. They were all around me now, pressing in from every direction. I could feel my fingertips starting to crystallize, the transformation creeping up my hands. The whispering had become a roar, and now I could almost understand it. Ancient, hungry words that no human throat could produce. 1 minute. I backed toward the furnace, drawing them in. My legs were growing stiff, the crystallization spreading. Through their translucent forms, I could see more of them pouring in through every entrance, filling the room with their cold, terrible presence. 30 seconds. My back pressed against the furnace door control. My arms were nearly solid now, transformed into living crystal. The beings pressed closer, their forms starting to solidify as they prepared to consume their prey. Now, with the last of my strength, I slammed the emergency furnace activation switch. The ancient door began to swing closed as jets of flame roared to life inside the chamber. The sudden heat made the creatures recoil, their misty forms swirling in confusion. I smiled through crystallized lips as the flames reached out like hungry fingers. "Burn," I whispered. The beings shrieked, a sound like breaking glass multiplied 1,000 times. The heat hit them like a physical force, their gaseous forms igniting, spreading the fire from one to another in a chain reaction of blue-white flame. They tried to flee, but the conflagration spread faster than they could move, consuming them in seconds. The last thing I remember is the feeling of my crystallized form beginning to crack in the intense heat, and a sense of satisfaction knowing that the town was safe. "John," it said in that wrong voice, "I'm not Lisa anymore. I'm not Sarah anymore either. We're something better now. Come inside and let us show you." My radio burst to life again, making me jump. This time it was Dave's voice. "John, don't trust anything you see. I just found Sarah, the real Sarah. She's with me at the North Lookout. She's hurt, but alive. Whatever's in that station, it's not her." The thing wearing Sarah's face snapped its head toward me. Its smile grew impossibly wide, and its eyes turned completely black. "That's not very nice of Dave," it said in that many voices way. "He shouldn't lie to you. Should we show him what happens to liars?" Then I heard a scream from the direction of the North Lookout, Dave's scream. It cut off suddenly, leaving that awful silence again. I started backing away from the station, but stopped when I felt something cold touch the back of my neck. I turned around slowly, already knowing what I'd see. There stood Mike, Lisa, and the thing that had been wearing the dead hiker's face. They had me surrounded. Their shadows were all wrong, stretching and twisting across the ground like living things. "It's time to join your team, John," they all said together. "The earth is hungry, and there are so many faces left to wear." I had only seconds to decide what to do. Maybe running would work, maybe hiding. But as I looked at the twisted versions of my friends surrounding me, I remembered something Lisa had said earlier about her grandmother's stories. Something about the earth, and what could drive these things back into it. I just hoped I was right about what I had to do next, because if I was wrong, there wouldn't be a second chance to fix it. Lisa's grandmother had said these things slept in the earth, that they came from the earth. Maybe, I thought, that's where they needed to go back to. I dove for my truck, grabbing the emergency gear bag from behind the seat. Inside was what I needed, the emergency flare gun. Not to shoot at them, but at something else. Poor John. The thing wearing Sarah's face said, "Still trying to fight? We're your friends, your team." "No," I said, loading the flare. "My friends would never hurt people. You're just wearing their faces." They all moved closer, their shadows writhing like snakes around their feet. But I wasn't aiming at them. I aimed up at the old ranger station's roof. The station was old, built right into the side of a hill, and under that hill was the biggest burial cave in the area, the one place you never went because the ground wasn't stable. One good cave-in would open up a deep hole right into the earth. I pulled the trigger. The flare shot up in a bright red streak, hitting the station's dry wooden roof. It caught fire immediately. The creatures stopped, watching the flames with their black eyes. "The ground here isn't stable," I said, backing away. "You want the earth? You can have it." The fire spread fast. I could hear the old wood cracking. The things that used to be my friends didn't move. They just kept staring at the flames, like they were hypnotized. Then it happened. With a loud groan, the burning station supports gave way. The whole building collapsed, taking a big chunk of the hillside with it. The ground cracked open like a giant mouth. The creatures screamed, not with people voices anymore, but with sounds I hope I never hear again. Their shadows started pulling them toward the hole, like they were being sucked in by a giant vacuum. "This isn't over," they said in their many voices as the earth pulled them in. "We'll sleep again, but we'll wake up. We always wake up." The hole in the ground swallowed them up, taking the burning pieces of the station with it. Then the earth closed back over them like a scar healing. In the sudden quiet, I heard someone calling my name. Real voices this time. Sarah and Dave came stumbling out of the darkness. The real Sarah and Dave, I could tell by their shadows, which were just normal shadows now. They had managed to escape when the creatures were distracted by me. We never found the real Mike or Lisa. The thing had taken them too early, before we even knew what was happening. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if they're still down there, in the dark under the earth, or if they're at peace now. We reported it as a fire and a cave-in. Who would believe the truth? The tribal elders came and blessed the ground. They put up warnings to keep people away. But sometimes, when I drive past that area at night, I think I see shadows moving in ways shadows shouldn't move. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, I think I hear voices calling from deep in the earth, wearing faces that don't belong to them, waiting to wake up again. That was 28 years ago. I retired from the ranger service not long after. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I hear those many voices calling my name. Sarah and Dave stayed on as rangers, but they transferred to different parks. We still keep in touch, but we never talk about what happened. Some things are better left in the dark. Last week, I got a letter from the tribal elders. They said the ground at the old burial sites is starting to shift again. Some hikers reported hearing voices that sound like Mike and Lisa calling for help. I burned the letter, but I keep my old flare gun loaded, just in case. Because they were right about one thing, they always wake up, and someone needs to be ready when they do. The hardest part isn't the nightmares, or the guilt about Mike and Lisa. The hardest part is walking past people on the street and wondering, just for a second, if their shadows look right. If their smile is a little too wide, if their voice sounds like many voices trying to be one. So if you're ever hiking in the Badlands, and you hear someone you know calling for help, don't go looking. If you see someone walking strange, like they're wearing a body that doesn't quite fit, run the other way. And if the ground starts to feel wrong under your feet, like something's moving down there, well, just remember, not all faces you see belong to people. And some things that sleep in the earth should stay there. That's my story. I don't expect you to believe it. Most days I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw. I know what happened to my team. And I know that somewhere deep under the Badlands, those things are still there. Still wearing the faces of my friends. Still waiting to wake up again. The crackle of my radio pierced the pre-dawn silence. Station 7 to Wilson. Come in. Martin's voice carried an edge I'd never heard before in our 3 years working together at Yellowstone. Lowering my thermos of coffee, I grabbed the radio from my belt. Wilson here? What's wrong? Better get up to Specimen Ridge. Found another one. The static couldn't mask his shaking breath, just like the others. My stomach clenched. 4th elk this month. The summer tourist season was winding down, but these killings were ramping up. As lead wildlife officer, I'd seen my share of predator attacks, bears, wolves, mountain lions, but nothing like this. On my way, stay put. I was already shoving the thermos into my pack and heading for my truck. Lucy, Martin hesitated. There's something else. Tracks in the mud. There. Different. The early September air bit through my ranger jacket as I climbed into the cab. Different how? You need to see for yourself. Just hurry. I fired up the engine, tires crunching over pine needles as I pulled away from my cabin. The sun wouldn't rise for another hour, and darkness pressed against my headlights. Normally, I loved these quiet morning patrols, watching steam rise off the hot springs, spotting elk emerging from the tree line, hearing the first birds wake. But lately, something felt wrong in my beloved park. The 2-track service road wound up toward Specimen Ridge, the truck's suspension groaning over ruts and rocks. My headlights caught the reflective strips of Martin's jacket before I saw him. He stood rigid beside his own vehicle, flashlight beam fixed on something in the grass. I killed the engine and grabbed my gear. The beam of my own light joined his, illuminating the scene. The elk lay on its side, massive body intact except for where the neck simply ended. The head was gone, removed with surgical precision. No blood, no signs of struggle, just like the others. Jesus, I breathed, crouching beside the carcass. The grass around it was undisturbed, no drag marks, no prints from predators. How long? Can't be more than a few hours. Body's still warm. Martin's voice was tight. But Lucy, the tracks. I followed his light to where it trembled over the mud at the edge of a shallow creek. The impression there made my skin crawl. It was like a footprint, but wrong, over 2 feet long, with deep grooves like tree bark instead of skin. Whatever made it had been bipedal, walking on 2 legs. Could be a hoax, I said, more to convince myself than Martin. Some kids playing. Look at the depth, he interrupted. Whatever made these weighs hundreds of pounds, and they lead straight into the trees. His light swept the dark wall of pines. There's more. I found this. He handed me a weathered scrap of leather, covered in faded symbols I didn't recognize. Where? Nailed to a tree, about 50 yards that way. There's others too, forming a circle. Old Native American warnings, I think. I've never seen them before. The leather felt oddly warm in my hand. One symbol stood out, a crude stick figure, impossibly tall and thin, with branch-like limbs and what looked like antlers crowning its head. A twig snapped in the forest behind us. We both spun, lights cutting through branches. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw something move, something that shouldn't have been there. Something that walked like a man but stretched up into the canopy. Martin's radio crackled. Station 7, we've got another body at Tower Junction. Same condition. Over. I keyed my own radio. This is Wilson. Secure the scene, we're on our way. I turned to Martin. Document everything here first. Photos, measurements, samples. Then we'll head to Tower. He nodded, but his eyes kept drifting to the trees. Lucy, what if these aren't random attacks? What if it's hunting us? The question hung in the air like frost. I had no answer, but as I stared into those dark woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something stared back, something ancient, something hungry, something that walked. Dawn was breaking over Yellowstone, painting the sky in watercolor pinks and purples. But for the first time in my career, I found myself dreading the long day ahead. Because now I knew we weren't alone in this park, and whatever was out there, it was getting bolder. The drive to Tower Junction was tense. Martin followed in his truck, our headlights cutting twin paths through the lingering darkness. I couldn't stop thinking about those tracks, about that leather warning. In my 15 years as a ranger, I'd learned to trust my instincts. Right now, they were screaming. The radio crackled again. Wilson, this is Chief Hayes. How far out are you? 10 minutes, sir. I noticed my knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Make it 5. We've got reporters sniffing around already. I need my lead wildlife officer here before this turns into a circus. Perfect. Just what we needed, media attention. Copy that. But sir, there's something you should know about the Specimen Ridge scene. A massive shape suddenly loomed in my headlights. I slammed the brakes, tires skidding on the gravel road. Martin's truck swerved behind me. It wasn't an animal, not really. For a frozen moment I saw it clearly, a towering figure easily 12 feet tall, its body like gnarled wood and moss. Antlers sprouted from what should have been its head, silhouetted against the lightening sky. Then it was gone, melting into the trees with impossible grace for something so large. My radio buzzed. Lucy, did you see? Yeah. My voice shook. I saw it. What the hell was that thing? I stared at the empty road ahead, heart hammering. I don't know, but I think we just found our killer. The rest of the drive passed in a blur. By the time we reached Tower Junction, golden morning light was spilling over the park. A small crowd had gathered. other rangers, park police, and sure enough, a news van from the local station. Chief Hayes met us at the perimeter tape. He was a barrel-chested man with 30 years of park service under his belt, but right now he looked rattled. "Wilson, Martin, glad you're here. This one's different." Different was an understatement. The victim was one of our seasonal rangers, Tom Chen. Like the elk, his head was missing, but this time there was blood. So much blood. His body lay sprawled next to his truck, keys still in his hand. He'd been trying to run. I crouched beside him, pushing down my horror to focus on details. The cut was clean, just like the animal's. But there were other marks too, long gouges in his ranger jacket, as if massive claws had held him in place. "Found this in his truck," Hayes said quietly, handing me a digital camera. "Last photos he took." I scrolled through them, Martin looking over my shoulder. Mostly standard stuff, tourists at overlooks, wildlife, geological features. Then I stopped. The last image, taken just hours ago, showed a dark figure among the trees. It was blurry, but unmistakable, impossibly tall, with a crown of antlers. The timestamp read 3:47 a.m. "There's more," Hayes continued. "Got a call from the Crow Reservation this morning. Their tribal historian wants to talk to you. Says it's urgent." I handed the camera back, my mind racing. "The leather warnings we found, they're Crow markers, aren't they?" Hayes nodded grimly. "They've been trying to tell us something. Maybe it's time we listened." The drive to the reservation took an hour. Martin insisted on coming with me, while Hayes stayed behind to manage the growing media presence. Neither of us spoke much. What was there to say? We'd seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, and now one of our own was dead. Sarah Blackfeather, the tribal historian, was waiting for us in her office at the Cultural Center. She was a small woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to look right through you. Before we could even sit down, she spread an ancient map across her desk. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked. "The tall one, the hide behind." I shared a look with Martin. "We saw something this morning on the road. It walks like a man but is not a man, wears antlers like a crown but is not a deer, moves through trees like shadow but is not darkness." She traced a finger over symbols on the map, the same ones from the leather warnings. "My people have known about it for centuries. We marked its territory, tried to warn others away, but your government built roads through its hunting grounds, brought crowds of tourists. Now it's angry." "What exactly is it?" Martin asked. Sarah's eyes darkened. "Some say it's a spirit, a guardian of sacred places. Others believe it's something older, something that was here before humans walked the earth. We call it Apatamuta, the one who walks behind. Your people named it the hide behind." "Why is it killing now?" I pressed. "Why take the heads?" "It's not killing," she corrected. "It's harvesting, collecting. The heads are trophies. And it's not just starting now, it's been taking animals for months. But you only noticed when the bodies started showing up where you could find them." A chill ran down my spine. "It's getting bolder." She nodded. "More than that, it's getting ready. The taking of a human head, that's new. In all our stories, it's never done that before. Something has changed. How do we stop it?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "You don't understand. You can't stop it. The best you can do is stay out of its territory until winter comes. It sleeps then, hibernates like a bear. But if you try to hunt it," she shook her head, "it will hunt you back." I thought of Tom Chen's body, of the blood-stained gravel. We can't just let it kill people. "Then at least let me tell you what you're dealing with. The hide behind is ancient, powerful, but it has rules. It can't enter buildings. It won't cross running water when the sun is up. And it always warns its prey before it strikes." She pulled out an old journal, its pages yellow with age. "These are accounts from my grandfather's time, the last big hunting season. Maybe they'll help you survive." The word choice wasn't lost on me. Survive, not win. We left with the journal and a growing sense of dread. The sun was high now, the September day warming up. Tourists were flooding into the park, oblivious to the horror we'd discovered. As we drove back, I couldn't help scanning the tree line, looking for something that shouldn't be there. "Lucy," Martin said suddenly, "the rangers who found Tom's body, they said his truck was running when they got there. Engine on, lights on. So why would he stop? If something that big was chasing him, why not just drive away?" The question haunted me all the way back to headquarters, but I had a feeling we'd find out the answer soon enough. The next few days passed in a blur of increased patrols, media statements, and sleepless nights. We closed several hiking trails, citing dangerous wildlife activity, but we all knew that wouldn't stop it. The hide-behind wasn't bound by our signs and fences. I spent every spare moment poring over Sarah's grandfather's journal. The accounts were chilling, stories of hunters who ventured too deep into the woods, only to be found days later, headless and arranged in ritualistic poses. But there were patterns, too. The creature seemed to focus on those who entered its territory alone. It followed them for days, letting them catch glimpses, wearing them down mentally before striking. "Like a cat playing with its prey," Martin observed one evening as we reviewed the latest sighting reports in my office. The walls were covered in maps now, red pins marking each incident. They formed a rough circle, with Tower Junction at its center. But why now? I wondered aloud. Sarah said it's never taken a human head before. What changed? Before Martin could answer, our radios crackled simultaneously. "All units. We have a situation at the Old Faithful Inn. Multiple visitors reporting strange noises and movement in the trees. Rangers requesting backup." I was already grabbing my jacket. That's miles outside its usual territory. "It's expanding its hunting ground," Martin said grimly. "We took separate vehicles, standard procedure now, ever since Tom. The drive to Old Faithful seemed to take forever, though we were pushing speed limits the whole way." The sun was setting, painting the sky in bloody reds and deep purples. The historic inn loomed ahead, its wooden architecture, usually so welcoming now, seeming ominous in the dying light. Tourists were clustered on the front steps, pointing and taking pictures of something in the surrounding forest. Rangers held them back, trying to maintain order. I spotted Hayes talking to the hotel manager. "What's the situation?" "Started about an hour ago," he replied. "Staff member taking out trash saw something by the tree line. Then guests started reporting noises, like wood creaking but louder, and footprints in the thermal area." "Show me." The thermal area around Old Faithful was eerily quiet. Usually, there would be dozens of visitors waiting for the next eruption. Now, the boardwalks were empty save for our small group. Steam rose from the various pools and vents, creating an otherworldly atmosphere in the gathering darkness. The footprints were there, pressed deep into the mineral-crusted earth. But something was different about them. They seemed deliberate, almost like, "It's a pattern," Martin said suddenly. "Look." He was right. The tracks formed a huge circle around Old Faithful itself, with strange symbols pressed into the ground at regular intervals. I recognized them from Sarah's warnings. "It's marking territory," I realized. But why here? Why now? A low, groaning sound echoed through the trees, like an ancient tree bending in the wind. But there was no wind tonight. Every head snapped toward the noise. In the fading light, I could have sworn I saw movement among the lodgepole pines, something tall and thin, moving with unnatural grace. "Get everyone inside," I ordered. Now, but it was too late. A scream cut through the evening air, high, terrified, and suddenly silenced. It came from behind the inn, where the employee parking lot was located. "Martin with me," I called, drawing my sidearm. "Hayes, lock down the inn. No one in or out." We ran around the building, boots pounding on the gravel. The parking lot was poorly lit, shadows stretching between the scattered vehicles. A car door hung open, interior light spilling out. Personal items were scattered across the ground. A purse, a set of keys, a name tag reading Sarah Miller, housekeeping, and blood, fresh blood, gleaming black in the dim light. But no body. "Lucy!" Martin's voice shook. He was pointing his flashlight at something on the ground. Another leather warning, this one fresh and wet with blood. The symbols were different from the others we'd found. "We need to translate this," I said. "Call Sarah Blackfeather." A massive shadow fell over us. The air grew cold, carrying the smell of wet wood and decay. Slowly, we turned around. It stood there, between us and the inn. 12 feet of twisted bark-like flesh, arms too long and fingers like branches, its antlers scraped against the roof overhang. Where its face should have been, there was only darkness. Martin fired first. The shots echoed across the parking lot, but the bullets seemed to pass right through the creature, embedding themselves in the wall behind it. It didn't even flinch. "Run!" I screamed, shoving him toward the nearest vehicle. We split up, diving between cars as the thing moved, faster than anything that size should be able to move. I heard Martin's footsteps pounding away, then a horrible splintering sound. I risked a look. The hide-behind had him pinned against a truck, those branch-like fingers wrapped around his throat. Martin's eyes met mine, wide with terror. "Lucy," he gasped. "The journal, page 47. Then the creature moved, a fluid motion too quick to follow. There was a wet sound, and Martin's body crumpled to the ground. No head. I ran like I'd never run before, past the inn into the woods. I could hear it behind me, moving through the trees with that terrible grace. My lungs burned, legs trembled, but I couldn't stop. Martin's last words echoed in my head, page 47. I don't know how long I ran. The moon rose, casting silver light through the canopy. Finally, my legs gave out, and I collapsed against a tree. My radio was gone, lost somewhere. The static crackled through my radio as I made my way up the narrow trail, dead leaves crunching beneath my boots. Another missing hiker report had come in, the third one this month. As senior ranger at Shenandoah National Park, these cases weighed heavily on me. But something about this one felt different. "Powell, you copy? Over." Sarah's voice cut through the white noise. "Copy, base. Any updates on the coordinates? Over. Last known location was near Cedar Creek Cave System. Hiker's vehicle still in the Thompson Gap lot. No movement on their satellite phone for 48 hours. I clicked my radio in acknowledgement, adjusting my pack as I climbed higher into the autumn-painted mountains. The morning fog clung to the peaks like a funeral shroud, unusually thick for mid-October. 23 years I'd worked these trails, and I'd never seen anything like the pattern emerging these past few months. Hikers vanishing without a trace, always near the cave networks that honeycombed these ancient hills. The first disappearance barely raised flags. Solo hikers occasionally went off-trail, though most turned up eventually. But then came the Benedict family in September. Mother, father, 2 kids, all experienced outdoors people. Their campsite was found intact, meals half-eaten, no signs of wildlife disturbance or struggle, just gone. Now this latest case, James Chen, 34, environmental photographer working on a piece about limestone cave formations. His emergency beacon had activated briefly 2 days ago, then nothing. The trail narrowed as I approached the cave system, the temperature dropping several degrees. Cedar Creek Cave was actually a vast network of interconnected caverns, most of them unmapped. Local indigenous stories warned of dark things dwelling in these depths, but I'd always dismissed them as campfire tales meant to keep kids from wandering too far. The cave mouth gaped before me like an open wound in the mountainside. I pulled out my flashlight and radio. "Base, Powell here. At cave entrance, beginning search pattern Alpha. Radio check in 15 minutes. Over." "Copy that." "Be careful in there, Derek. Something feels off about this one." I'd known Sarah 20 years. She wasn't prone to paranoia. Her unease mirrored my own growing sense of wrongness. Taking a deep breath, I clicked on my light and entered the darkness. The first 100 yards followed typical cave formation, limestone walls, occasional stalactites, nothing unusual. But as I pressed deeper, things began to change. The air grew thick with an unfamiliar odor, not the usual cave mustiness, but something organic, almost sweet, like rotting fruit mixed with copper. My light caught something reflective on the cave floor. Crouching down, I found a high-end camera, lens cracked but otherwise intact, Chen's equipment, but no signs of a fall or struggle. Just the camera, carefully placed on a relatively flat rock. Base. Found victim's camera near entrance. Continuing deeper. Over. Only static answered. The rock walls must have been blocking transmission already. Standard procedure said to retreat, wait for backup. But if Chen was down here hurt, the passage twisted downward, opening into a larger chamber. My light beam caught more reflective objects, and my blood ran cold. Gear, dozens of backpacks, cameras, phones, watches. Some covered in dust, others relatively new, all carefully arranged along the walls like some twisted museum display. Movement flickered at the edge of my light. I swung around, heart pounding. Nothing but shadows. But the sweet copper smell was stronger here, mixed with something else. Something that triggered deep animal instincts screaming danger. A scraping sound echoed from deeper in the cave. Then another, closer. The light caught something pale moving in the darkness. Too pale, too fluid to be human. But undeniably humanoid. My training warred with primitive terror as more shapes emerged from the shadows. Tall, emaciated figures with milk-white skin that had never seen sunlight. Faces that were almost human, but wrong in subtle ways that sent shivers down my spine. Eyes adapted for darkness, huge and black as the cave itself. They moved with unsettling grace, surrounding me with practiced efficiency. Hunting behavior. Pack coordination. My light beam caught glimpses of sharp teeth, elongated fingers ending in wicked claws. I reached for my sidearm, but they were too fast. Something hard struck the back of my head. As consciousness faded, I saw more of them emerging from hidden tunnels, carrying new prizes to add to their collection. The last thing I heard was a sound almost like language, clicking and whistles that might have been words, discussing their latest catch. They found my radio 3 days later, smashed at the cave entrance. The official report lists me as missing, presumed dead, another statistic in the park's files. But death would have been a mercy compared to what actually happened in the depths below Cedar Creek Cave. Sometimes, in my more lucid moments, I think about the others they've taken, the strong ones they keep alive, breeding stock for their colony. I hear the screams echoing through the tunnels, growing more inhuman with each generation, and I wonder how long these creatures have been down here, waiting in the dark, slowly building their numbers. The Park Service sealed the cave entrance after my disappearance, but we all know there are other ways in and out of the mountain, other entrances, other caves. So consider this my warning. Stay on the marked trails, and if you're hiking the Appalachian Trail near Shenandoah and you catch a sweet copper smell on the wind, run. Run as fast as you can, because they're getting stronger, getting bolder, and sooner or later, they'll need to expand their hunting grounds. From the recovered journal of Ranger Derek Powell found in Cedar Creek Cave during the 1994 Geological Survey. Additional pages were discovered but proved unreadable due to extensive water damage and what appeared to be bite marks. The cave system has since been permanently sealed by order of the Department of the Interior. The wind howled through the pines that October evening, carrying something else with it, something that made every hair on my neck stand straight up. 23 years as a ranger in the Boundary Waters hadn't prepared me for what that sound really was, or what it would lead to. If I'd known then what was really echoing across Basswood Lake, I would have radioed in sick and locked myself in the ranger station until sunrise. But that's not what Mike O'Connor did. No, Mike O'Connor had to be the dedicated ranger, had to investigate those screams because that's what the job demanded. That's what Sarah would have wanted too, God rest her soul. She always said I was too devoted to the job, right up until that heart attack took her last spring. Maybe she was right. Maybe if I hadn't been so dedicated to these woods, I would have spent more time with her in those final months. The call came in around 7:15 p.m. from a group of canoeists who'd made camp on Washington Island. They reported hearing ungodly screaming coming from the mainland, somewhere along the northwestern shore. With darkness settling in and temperatures dropping into the low 30s, I figured it was probably just some inexperienced campers in trouble. We got those types sometimes, city folks who didn't respect the wilderness enough, who thought camping in near-freezing weather would be a fun weekend adventure. I loaded up my patrol boat with emergency supplies and headed out. The lake surface was choppy, waves slapping against the aluminum hull as I cut through the growing darkness. My spotlight carved through the mist rising off the water, creating weird shadows that seemed to dance and twist in my peripheral vision. The deeper I went into the bay, the more the screaming became distinct. Not quite human, but not quite animal either. It had this rhythmic quality to it, almost musical, but wrong somehow, like someone trying to imitate a song they'd only heard once, and badly. The first campsite I checked was empty, just some old ashes in the fire pit. The second one too, but at the third site. Christ, I'll never forget what I found there. The camp itself looked normal at first glance. 2 tents still properly staked down, camping gear neatly arranged, even a pot of something sitting on a camp stove. But there was this smell. Anyone who's worked search and rescue knows that smell, the copper penny reek of blood, but this was different, sweeter somehow, mixed with something that reminded me of burnt plastic. My flashlight beam caught something red and wet, glistening on one of the tent walls. As I got closer, I realized with growing horror that the wall wasn't just stained, it was soaked through from the inside. When I unzipped the tent flap, my light revealed something that defied everything I knew about anatomy and what the human body was supposed to look like. The sleeping bags inside contained what was left of 2 people, but they were wrong. It was like someone had reached inside them and pulled everything out through their pores. Skin peeled back and folded outward like blooming flowers made of meat. Organs somehow pushed through spaces too small to contain. The faces were the worst, frozen in expressions of such profound terror that I had to look away or risk losing my dinner. I keyed my radio with shaking hands, but all I got was static. Not unusual in these parts, but the timing couldn't have been worse. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Someone was singing. A soft, gentle humming that I recognized instantly because I'd heard it thousands of times before. Sarah's lullaby, the one she used to sing to our daughter before the crib death took her 30 years ago. I whirled around, flashlight beam dancing wildly across the trees. The singing stopped. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, a voice called out, "Mike? Baby, is that you?" It was her voice, perfect in every detail, the slight southern drawl from her Tennessee childhood, the way she always said my name like it was wrapped in honey. But Sarah was dead. I'd watched them lower her into the ground 6 months ago. "Who's out there?" I called, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. My free hand went to the grip of my service weapon. The laugh that answered me started as Sarah's, that warm, gentle chuckle I'd fallen in love with. But it changed halfway through, twisting into something that sounded like metal grinding on bone. Movement caught my eye, and I swung my light toward it. Something stepped out from behind a massive pine tree. In the fraction of a second before I scrambled backward, I saw what looked like Sarah's face stretched across something that only approximated a human head. The features were running like melted wax, reforming themselves even as I watched. The body below was worse, a twisted architecture of limbs that bent in impossible ways, skin that rippled and flowed like water. I ran. God help me. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Behind me, that thing called out with Sarah's voice again, begging me to wait, to come back, that she missed me so much. Each word was like a knife in my gut, but I kept going. The beam of my flashlight bounced crazily as I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I could hear it moving through the woods parallel to me, not running but flowing from tree to tree with a horrible liquid grace, sometimes to my left, sometimes to my right, playing with it. The voices it made changed rapidly now. Sarah's voice, then someone else's terrified screams, then a sound like 1,000 whispers all talking at once. The shore had to be close. If I could just reach my boat. My foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard, flashlight flying from my grip. It hit a rock and went out, plunging me into darkness broken only by the weak moonlight filtering through the canopy. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for breath. The woods had gone completely silent. "Why are you running, Mike?" Sarah's voice came from directly behind me. "Don't you want to hold me again?" I turned slowly, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. The thing that wore my dead wife's face stood 3 feet away. In the dim light, I could see other faces rippling beneath the surface of its skin, twisted, agonized faces that I realized with dawning horror must have belonged to the people from the campsite. They shifted and changed like clouds moving across the moon, merging and separating in nauseating pattern. "You can join us," it said, still using Sarah's voice. But other voices were leaking in now, harmonizing with hers in a horrible chorus. "We can be together forever, like we promised." It reached for me with too many fingers, the arms stretching and undulating like smoke-given flesh. I drew my gun and fired, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating a scene that my mind still refuses to fully process. The thing wearing Sarah's face split open like a flower blooming in fast forward, revealing a darkness deeper than the space between stars. I emptied my magazine into it. The bullets passed through without effect, and that terrible laugh echoed through the trees again. The last thing I remember clearly is those impossible arms wrapping around me, Sarah's voice whispering, "I love you," as something hot and wet began burrowing through my skin. They found me 3 days later, half frozen but somehow alive, curled up in my boat which had drifted to the middle of the lake. The campsite showed signs of violence when they investigated, but no bodies were ever found. The official report blamed hypothermia for my hallucinations, and implied that the missing campers had simply packed up and left without properly checking out. But I know what I saw. I know what's really out there in those woods, wearing familiar faces and singing with stolen voices. Sometimes late at night when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear Sarah singing that lullaby. And sometimes, God help me, I want to follow it back into those dark woods, just to see her face one more time. I retired from the Ranger service after that night, moved to Arizona where the desert sun bakes away any shadows that might hide something unnatural. But even here, 3 decades later, I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, my skin crawling with the memory of something trying to turn me inside out. To anyone planning a trip to the Boundary Waters, especially around Washington Island, if you hear singing in the woods at night, or someone you love calling your name, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because whatever's calling you isn't what you think it is, and it's always hungry for more faces to add to its collection. The summer heat pressed down like a wet blanket as I guided my patrol boat through the murky channels of the Okefenokee Swamp. 23 years had passed since that August of '86, but the memories remain as sharp as cypress knees breaking the water's surface. Back then, I was Ranger Victoria Nash, newly assigned to the southeastern sector of the refuge. Now, I'm just Victoria, the woman who tells this story from her wheelchair, wondering if anyone will believe what really happened in those dark waters. The disappearances started with the Cooley brothers. Local gator hunters, they knew the swamp better than their own backyards. When they missed their weekly supply run at Miller's General Store, folks assumed they'd just found a good hunting spot. But after 2 weeks without word, their wives came to the ranger station demanding answers. I remember studying their permit application that morning, the paper already yellowing in the humid air. The brothers had listed their planned hunting zone as the Devil's Pocket, a remote section of the swamp where the water ran deep and dark. Something about that name should have warned me. The search began routinely enough. I took my patrol boat out at dawn, following their recorded route. Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from the cypress trees, and every now and then, a gator's eyes would break the surface, watching. The air smelled different out there, not just the usual swamp rot and stagnant water, but something else, something metallic, like old pennies left in the sun. By midday, I'd found their John boat, half submerged near a small island. The vessel showed no signs of damage, just abandoned. Their gear was still there, rifles secured, bait boxes full of rotting meat. No signs of struggle, no blood. Just an empty boat slowly being reclaimed by the swamp. The island itself drew my attention. Unlike the typical cypress stands, this one had a clearing. As I secured my boat and stepped onto solid ground, my boots crunched on something that wasn't leaves or twigs. Looking down, I saw bones. Hundreds of them, bleached white by the sun, arranged in precise geometric patterns. Most were animal bones, deer, boar, gator, but some looked unsettlingly human. They formed concentric circles, each ring larger than the last, spreading out from a central point like ripples in still water. Some stood upright, jabbed into the soft earth like macabre fence posts. Others were woven together with vines and sinew to create archways that couldn't have formed naturally. The scientific part of my mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe this was some kind of predator's killing ground or an old Native American burial site. But those explanations crumbled when I saw how fresh some of the arrangements were. The soil around certain bones was newly disturbed. Some still had flesh clinging to them. I radioed for backup, trying to keep my voice steady as I reported finding a potential crime scene. The radio crackled with static before going dead. That's when I heard it, a sound like wet leather being dragged across stones, coming from the other side of the boneyard. Training took over. I drew my service revolver and moved toward the noise, using the bone structures as cover. The dragging sound stopped, replaced by a wet, rhythmic clicking. It reminded me of a bullfrog's call, but deeper, more deliberate, almost like speech. Through gaps in the bone archways, I caught glimpses of movement. Something large was moving parallel to me, keeping pace. Its outline suggested a humanoid shape, but the proportions were wrong. The head was too wide, the limbs too long and bent at unnatural angles. Water dripped from its form with each movement, and its skin had the slick sheen of a salamander's back. I'd heard the old stories about the Loveland frog, of course. Every ranger in the southeastern waterways knew the legend of the amphibian humanoid. But those were Ohio tales, not Georgia folklore. This was something different, something older. The thing moved with purpose, arranging bones as it went. I watched it lift a femur with webbed hands, examining it with the care of a museum curator before adding it to one of its grotesque sculptures. That's when I realized this wasn't just a killing ground. It was an art gallery, a collection. My foot slipped on a piece of bone, causing a sharp crack. The creature's head snapped toward me with frightening speed. For the first time, I saw its face clearly through the gaps in its bone gallery. No eyes, just smooth portions of skull where eyes should be, with deep sensory pits like those of a pit viper. Its mouth was a wide slash filled with needle-sharp teeth, and gill-like structures pulsed along its neck. What happened next plays out in my nightmares with perfect clarity. The creature moved faster than anything its size should be capable of. One moment it was 20 yards away, the next it was launching itself through one of its bone archways straight at me. I fired twice, the gunshots deafening in the swamp's silence. The bullets struck true. I saw them impact, but the creature's flesh seemed to absorb them like water, absorbing stones. I ran. The boat was only 50 yards away, but it felt like miles. Behind me, I heard that wet slapping sound getting closer, accompanied by that terrible clicking speech. I made it to the water's edge before something wrapped around my ankles, not hands, but some kind of extensible tongue or tentacle. The pain was immediate and overwhelming as the creature began to drag me backward. I clawed at the ground, my fingers leaving deep furrows in the mud, but it was no use. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was being pulled into an underwater cave entrance, the creature's collection of bones gleaming in the fading light above. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Folkestone. A search party had found me washed up on a sandbar 2 miles from where I'd left my boat. The doctors said the tissue damage to my legs was unlike anything they'd seen. Not quite a bite, not quite a chemical burn, but something in between. They couldn't save them. The official report blamed an alligator attack. Nice and simple, logical. But I know what I saw, and I know why it let me live. Sometimes, when I look at the stumps of my legs, I imagine them cleaned and bleached, arranged in one of those beautiful, terrible bone sculptures, a small piece of its collection that got away. The Cooley brothers were never found, and they weren't the last to disappear in that part of the swamp. Every few years, another hunter or hiker vanishes. The locals know to avoid the devil's pocket now, especially after sunset. They say on quiet nights, if you drift near that island, you can hear that wet clicking sound echoing across the water, like something ancient is calling out, inviting you to join its collection. I've never gone back to the swamp, but sometimes, on humid nights when my phantom limbs ache the worst, I swear I can smell that metallic scent. And in those moments I know it's still out there, arranging its bones, building its grotesque art gallery, and waiting for the next visitor to admire its work. The static crackled through my radio as I made my way up the narrow trail, dead leaves crunching beneath my boots. Another missing hiker report had come in, the third one this month. As senior ranger at Shenandoah National Park, these cases weighed heavily on me, but something about this one felt different. "Powell, you copy? Over." Sarah's voice cut through the white noise. "Copy, base. Any updates on the coordinates? Over. Last known location was near Cedar Creek Cave System. Hiker's vehicle still in the Thompson Gap lot. No movement on their satellite phone for 48 hours. I clicked my radio in acknowledgement, adjusting my pack as I climbed higher into the autumn-painted mountains. The morning fog clung to the peaks like a funeral shroud, unusually thick for mid-October. 23 years I'd worked these trails, and I'd never seen anything like the pattern emerging these past few months. Hikers vanishing without a trace, always near the cave networks that honeycombed these ancient hills. The first disappearance barely raised flags. Solo hikers occasionally went off-trail, though most turned up eventually. But then came the Benedict family in September. Mother, father, 2 kids, all experienced outdoors people. Their campsite was found intact, meals half-eaten, no signs of wildlife disturbance or struggle, just gone. Now this latest case, James Chen, 34, environmental photographer working on a piece about limestone cave formations. His emergency beacon had activated briefly 2 days ago, then nothing. The trail narrowed as I approached the cave system, the temperature dropping several degrees. Cedar Creek Cave was actually a vast network of interconnected caverns, most of them unmapped. Local indigenous stories warned of dark things dwelling in these depths, but I'd always dismissed them as campfire tales meant to keep kids from wandering too far. The cave mouth gaped before me like an open wound in the mountainside. I pulled out my flashlight and radio. "Base, Powell here. At cave entrance, beginning search pattern Alpha. Radio check in 15 minutes. Over." "Copy that. Be careful in there, Derek. Something feels off about this one." I'd known Sarah 20 years. She wasn't prone to paranoia. Her unease mirrored my own growing sense of wrongness. Taking a deep breath, I clicked on my light and entered the darkness. The first 100 yards followed typical cave formation, limestone walls, occasional stalactites, nothing unusual. But as I pressed deeper, things began to change. The air grew thick with an unfamiliar odor, not the usual cave mustiness, but something organic, almost sweet, like rotting fruit mixed with copper. My light caught something reflective on the cave floor. Crouching down, I found a high-end camera, lens cracked but otherwise intact, Chen's equipment, but no signs of a fall or struggle. Just the camera, carefully placed on a relatively flat rock. Base. Found victim's camera near entrance. Continuing deeper. Over. Only static answered. The rock walls must have been blocking transmission already. Standard procedure said to retreat, wait for backup. But if Chen was down here hurt, the passage twisted downward, opening into a larger chamber. My light beam caught more reflective objects, and my blood ran cold. Gear, dozens of backpacks, cameras, phones, watches. Some covered in dust, others relatively new, all carefully arranged along the walls like some twisted museum display. Movement flickered at the edge of my light. I swung around, heart pounding. Nothing but shadows. But the sweet copper smell was stronger here, mixed with something else. Something that triggered deep animal instincts screaming danger. A scraping sound echoed from deeper in the cave. Then another, closer. The light caught something pale moving in the darkness. Too pale, too fluid to be human. But undeniably humanoid. My training warred with primitive terror as more shapes emerged from the shadows. Tall, emaciated figures with milk-white skin that had never seen sunlight. Faces that were almost human, but wrong in subtle ways that sent shivers down my spine. Eyes adapted for darkness, huge and black as the cave itself. They moved with unsettling grace, surrounding me with practiced efficiency. Hunting behavior. Pack coordination. My light beam caught glimpses of sharp teeth, elongated fingers ending in wicked claws. I reached for my sidearm, but they were too fast. Something hard struck the back of my head. As consciousness faded, I saw more of them emerging from hidden tunnels, carrying new prizes to add to their collection. The last thing I heard was a sound almost like language, clicking and whistles that might have been words, discussing their latest catch. They found my radio 3 days later, smashed at the cave entrance. The official report lists me as missing, presumed dead, another statistic in the park's files. But death would have been a mercy compared to what actually happened in the depths below Cedar Creek Cave. Sometimes, in my more lucid moments, I think about the others they've taken, the strong ones they keep alive, breeding stock for their colony. I hear the screams echoing through the tunnels, growing more inhuman with each generation, and I wonder how long these creatures have been down here, waiting in the dark, slowly building their numbers. The Park Service sealed the cave entrance after my disappearance, but we all know there are other ways in and out of the mountain, other entrances, other caves. So consider this my warning. Stay on the marked trails, and if you're hiking the Appalachian Trail near Shenandoah and you catch a sweet copper smell on the wind, run. Run as fast as you can, because they're getting stronger, getting bolder, and sooner or later, they'll need to expand their hunting grounds. From the recovered journal of Ranger Derek Powell found in Cedar Creek Cave during the 1994 Geological Survey. Additional pages were discovered but proved unreadable due to extensive water damage and what appeared to be bite marks. The cave system has since been permanently sealed by order of the Department of the Interior.